Well, greetings. Can everyone hear? I must confess to being supremely uncomfortable with this sort of thing. For some reason it makes me feel self-important or something. I like to stay away from the amplification, as if the video being made does not make me self-important. It's just a compounding of unnecessary technologies. My name is David Kennedy Bird. My program is called Foundations Collegium. I'm not here primarily to talk about Foundations Collegium. I want to talk about the importance of unity in a child's education. I will find an opportunity to slip in a little advertisement for my program toward the end. Let me just start in by reading the little blurb that I prepared for the newsletter. The universe is a chaotic mass of disconnected facts and irrelevant information. Well, not really. But that's the impression given by most conventional approaches to the structuring of an education, including the school that we all got, unless you're the rare exception. I attended mostly public schools. I had a good private school experience in 2nd through 4th grade, but I mean the quality of the curriculum and the quality of the environment were different, but the essential structure of what was being presented was the same. It was a lot of packets of stuff being blasted at you from different directions, and none of it was attached into one singular experience. And of course, kids don't know enough to find that frustrating, but in retrospect, I find it exceedingly frustrating. But I'm interrupting myself in the middle of what was supposed to be a blurb. Isn't there some way to help the child bring it all together into a meaningful picture? If God's world is a unity, how can we present it in a unified manner to our young people? And let me just go ahead and warn you, I am a Christian. This presentation is going to be chock full of Christian suppositions. I hope that isn't offensive to anybody present. There's a fellow named Richard Tarnas. He's an intellectual historian. He's been associated with the Esalen Institute. No one will ever accuse him of being a Christian. Fascinating guy, though. And he wrote a fascinating book called The Passion of the Western Mind, which I read a couple of years ago. And it's a history of ideas in the West, from the ancient Greeks. He sort of dips back a little bit before the ancient Greeks, up until the present, what many people have taken to calling the postmodern period. It's an intensely satisfying read. It's not huge, it's like that in paperback. So if you're wanting to grapple with the intellectual history of the West, it's a good resource. And the guy is fair as can be expected to Christianity and to religiosity in general. He does not misrepresent Christianity, and he actually presents what I took to be a reasonably accurate view of Christian theology, which is not always the case among secular intellectuals. But when he gets to the present day, he starts rhapsodizing about the fact that the more or less unified approach to cultural understanding that dominated the Western world all during the Middle Ages and well into the modern era has been falling to pieces, especially in recent decades. And what we often call the postmodern period is a time in which you are not supposed to view the world as a unity. And furthermore, in the postmodern period, I am not encouraged to see the world in the same way that you see the world, and that you see the world, and that y'all over there see the world, and these people see the world. Each of us can have a different vision of how reality works, and that's okay. And Richard Tarnas likes that. And the man, has cerebral biceps just bulging out of his ears. This is a highly intelligent man, and yet he finds it acceptable that in the contemporary world, our understanding of reality has been dashed into little pieces, and that these pieces are like the bits of Humpty Dumpty's shell. They just can't be gathered together again, no matter how many of the king's horses and men you assign to the task. He's not bothered by that. And a lot of other contemporary intellectuals aren't bothered by that either. I had a student, one of my all-star students a few years ago. She was interviewing at Brown University, and it was looking good. And an admissions counselor was taking her on a tour of the campus, and Laura, my student, was talking about how she enjoys gathering together information and perspective and forming a unified understanding of reality. And this admissions counselor said that at Brown, we will do everything in our power to cure you of that kind of thinking. They came out and said it. So it's not just sort of a tacit assumption. It's an approach to intellectual life that a lot of people are just pushing. That not only is it not necessary to have a unified understanding of reality, but it's actually a bad thing. We should foster this sort of dislocated, decentralized, disunified understanding of things. In your understanding of society, you might have this going on. In your understanding of literature, you might have this going on. In your understanding of political life, you might have this going on. In your understanding of family, you might have something over here going on. And there's no reason to bring all of it together. And the people who think you should bring it all together are guilty of a kind of violence against you. They are trying to force something unnatural upon you. I find this horrifying. I mean, what I find horrifying is the fact that more and more people today think that unity of perspective is a bad thing, or, at best, an unnecessary thing. Let's talk a little bit about this novel, Sense and Sensibility, by Jane Austen. If you've not read it, maybe you've seen the excellent film version that came out, 15 years ago. The film script was written by Emma Thompson, who also starred in the movie. She got a Golden Globe for it. On YouTube, you can find her Golden Globe acceptance speech, which is extremely funny. She does it in the character of Jane Austen. But let's talk a little bit about this novel. And let's pretend that I've distributed copies of this novel to each of you. I haven't, in fact, done that, but I'm going to pretend that I have. Okay, I'm going to give you 3 assignments, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of time to perform each of them. Your first assignment is to read 5 randomly selected chapters from this novel in no particular order. And based on your exposure to 5 random chapters, give me some kind of meaningful account of what the book is about. Got it? Okay. Very good, very good. Okay, on to the next one. Assignment number 2. Without having read the novel, I want you to discuss with me the 3 main characters. Okay, good. You've had enough time to do that. Your third assignment is as follows. Listen closely. I want you to memorize any 100 words from the novel. They cannot be in sequence. They have to be randomly selected. Ideally, you should select one from each page, just to make sure they don't follow in any kind of sequence. And then I want you to recite them back to me. Am I crowding you?
Yeah, you're getting a little too close.
Is this good? Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, obviously, these 3 assignments are ridiculous on the face of them. They're funny. There's a reason why they're funny. We all know, we just tacitly know that there's something ridiculous about trying to discuss something that we have not gained any kind of a unified, coherent sense of. Jane back down there. Is this world one world or many? And this is actually a problem that philosophers have been wrestling over for like 2,500 years. It's the problem of the one and the many. And that sounds a little too easy, but that's what they call it. That's what philosophers call it. Is diversity sort of the defining thing about reality, or is unity the defining thing about reality? And you could make a strong case for either of those. And actually, I think they're both true. um, you know, on different levels and in different ways. I don't think anyone would want to say that there is no sense in which reality is multifarious and multifaceted and has lots of stuff going on. Obviously it does. And that's not the perspective that's taken a hit in recent years. Everybody acknowledges that. What's taken a hit in recent years is the idea that there is something central that gives a texture to everything. God, whom I strongly believe to be real and to be the originator of all things, one of the most, we're always kind of getting into hot water when we start attributing adjectives to God. But one of the things that I think is central to who he is unity. And this universe that he brought into this universe, which comes from Latin, and it means it's like a single vast spinning thing. It's like a monolithic thing that turns upon itself, the universe. I love that. This universe that he created is characterized by unity. If you've studied mathematics, if you've studied the sciences, you have a sense of the unity of things. A lot of people grow up thinking that math is about all these squiggles that you have to make on the paper, and you have to understand the rules by which to make the squiggles come out right, and maybe they have something to do with apples and oranges. But mathematics is really the language by which reality operates, and there's something marvelously unified about it. Studying mathematics, and I don't mean 3 + 4 = 7. By mathematics, I mean the wild stuff, the crazy stuff that you get into at the higher levels. I think it gives you rare insights into the mind of God. Now, maybe that sounds like some kind of strange heresy, but I really do. I think the more you study higher math, the more of a sense you get of what an elegant mind God has, and a sense of what God may have had in mind when he created all of this stuff in the first place. There is a unity lying underneath all things. One of the central themes in the Old Testament is this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." It's the Shema. It's something that young Hebrew children mastered very early. It's like the core reality that they were taught to recognize about God, his unity, and by implication, the unity of his work. If you were doing a little tour through an art gallery, and in one particular wing, you've got a bunch of works featuring a single artist. You've got like 37 paintings, all by so-and-so, Matisse. One thing you're going to notice as you walk around looking at these different pieces is that there's sort of a common language that's spoken. I mean, there may be a lot of diversity of style. Maybe the stuff that he was doing in the teens is very different from the stuff he was doing in the 40s and 50s. Nevertheless, there's going to be a sense that the same guy was responsible for having created all of that. There is a unity. There is diversity, and there is unity. Let's get back to talking about Sense and Sensibility. You read through this novel, chapter by chapter, and you are gripped by the conviction, even if you don't know anything about Jane Austen, even if you don't know that this was written by a single, did I do that? Even if you don't know that this was written by a single author. Let's say somebody handed you this book and they told you it was a collection of short stories. Ha ha ha. But you can tell that's not true. Just from reading through it, the continuity from one chapter to the next, the thumbprint, Jane Austen's thumbprint on every chapter. She's got a certain charming approach. She's got a kind of wit that is inescapable. No one can. I did it again.
What's the danger zone?
Put technology and me in the same room, and bad things will result. You can tell that this was all the work of a single person. The universe is the same way. The universe was all the work of a single mind. And when we when we take a ball-peen hammer and we smack a child's education and break it up into little pieces, and the child is exposed to this piece over here, the literature of England since 1800, and this piece over here, pre-Revolutionary War American history, and this piece over here, elementary geometry, and all these pieces are distinct from each other. The kid may do very well in his studies. He may make straight A's. He may be a good student. We are not criticizing the child, but he will not emerge with a unified sense of what reality is all about. And there are certain reasons why this matters. I mean, if life were nothing but a series of tests, sit-down tests, multiple choice tests, then maybe this wouldn't be a big deal. But if life is a setting in which you have to go out into the world and engage ideas, some of these ideas have sobering implications. A lot of these ideas have to do with God or the absence of God. They have to do with social patterns and cultural patterns and political realities. And if you march out into that world with no sense of how everything fits together, no sense of how idea A may be connected to idea B, you're going to be lost, you're going to be confused, you're not going to have a GPS system that will enable you to navigate through this increasingly complicated and messy culture that we find ourselves surrounded by. So, if the curricular structure that most of us grew up with, and most of us are accustomed to, if it's so problematic, why is it even there? Where did all this stuff come from? And there's a long history to that. I mean, we could go into a history of education, basically from the Middle Ages to the present, and we could talk about how all these different disciplines emerged, and how each of them sort of established its own turf, how each of them established itself as a distinct area of study, and those who are experts in English literature or philosophy or theology or law came to view their turf with a kind of chauvinistic possessiveness. This is my turf, this is important, we're going to frame this discipline as if it is its own self-contained thing. And that has happened in the case of several dozen academic areas. And of course, kids who are in the 6th grade or the 9th grade, they don't study several dozen academic areas, but they study a few that we're all familiar with from junior high and high school. So we don't need to go through that whole history of education. But suffice it to say that for reasons that often have to do with social necessity and institutional necessity and other things, we have ended up with an educational structure that is broken up into this, and this. And if at some point a student doesn't learn to transcend the thisness of all these separate things, he or she will end up with a sort of a view of the world like a fly must have, with all these little segmented eyes. It's like, I can see that, and I can see that, and I can see that, and I can see that. And it's not all integrated into one picture. And maybe you've had the experience of talking to someone who, when talking about a certain political issue, they will seem to be coming from a certain perspective. But then if you switch the conversation on them and start talking about a certain social issue, they will appear to be coming from a different perspective. And you start talking theology, and they will appear to be coming from this perspective over here, and they don't really have an overall architecture to what they believe. And it's because they absorbed all these things from different sources. Okay, enough criticism, enough discussion. I mean, I think we're all on the same page here. I don't need to convince you guys that there's a problem with a shattered view of the world. What are some ways in which, as home educators, you guys can maybe reintroduce some unity into the curriculum? We will get to talking about my program in a few minutes, but first let's talk about some things that you can do on your own. One model for the integration of knowledge is what I call the horizontal model. And by that I mean the attempt to tie together the various things that the student is studying at any given time. let's say your student is in the fall semester of his 6th grade year. So in whatever ways seem feasible to you, I mean, don't bend over backwards and kill yourself, but if there are ways in which you can feasibly tie together the various things that your student is studying that semester, that's the horizontal model of integration. Taking all the things that the kid is studying at the same time and figuring out ways to enable him to see them as touching each other, to see them as representing different aspects of the same reality. Then there's the vertical model. And by that I mean trying to connect what the student was learning last year with what he's learning this year and what he's going to be learning next year and the year after that. Now there are some areas of study in which that naturally happens. Mathematics is one. In math, you naturally build from one semester or one year to the next. Some math curricula are actually a little bit more chaotic than that, but as a general rule, a math curriculum is going to be set up in a structural and sequenced way. It's built on the assumption that unity of understanding is important. I mean, you're not going to get math if you approach it randomly. But there are other areas, like literature, in which very often literature curricula, I feel like I'm getting back a lot.
Just keep on going.
Okay. Literature curricula are often structured in a, to my way of thinking, random sort of way. You'll read a story about a little Russian peasant from the Middle Ages, and then a story about an English sea captain that was written in the 1800s, and then a tree grows in Brooklyn, and then Beowulf, and then the Iliad, and there's no apparent sequencing. There's no apparent larger reason why these works are all being read together or in that order. Now, my solution to that is just sequence historically. Just start with the ancient world, expose the child to literature from the ancient world, and then gradually work your way up to the Middle Ages, and then the early modern world, the 1800s, the 20th century, so the kid gets a sense of A, how literature has sort of developed over the centuries, and B, how literature connects with history. Because these works were not written in a vacuum. They were written in historical and cultural situations. And so I think the child is the child is going to give you much better feedback. How's that for an inclusion of upsetting things happening in the background? The child is going to gain a better overall sense of what he's studying if there's some kind of order to it. And some literature curricula are arranged thematically, like this semester we're reading stories about the sea and mariners. Well, that's a kind of unity. I think sometimes it can be a sort of a forced unity, and I think historical unity is actually better, but maybe not. But the vertical model would just be any way in which you can tie together what the child was studying 3 years ago to what the child was studying 2 years ago, 1 year ago, this year, next year, the year following. So that it's like the student is moving along in a sequence of study that makes sense to him. It's like, oh, so that was the last step, and here comes the next step, and then the next step after that. Then there's what I call the oblique model. And the oblique model simply means you just find ways to connect things together. Not necessarily worrying about horizontal connections or vertical connections, but just seize every opportunity you can find to connect one thing that the child is studying with something else that the child is studying or has studied or will be studying. Even if it's kind of pell-mell, obliquely connecting things together is better than not connecting things together at all. And it can actually give you all kinds of spontaneous insights that you might not have come across otherwise. Then there's another level of integration, and again, I'm making some Christian assumptions here. the integration of scriptural knowledge with itself. If anyone in this, seminar room is not a Christian, this may be of very little interest to you. But I'm simply saying, enabling the student to tie together the various things that he or she understands to be true about God based on a study of the scriptures. And of course, one helpful way of doing this is by doing a complete read-through of the Bible. The sort of piecemeal, reading this verse, reading this verse, reading this verse, can be devotionally useful, but it doesn't give the kid any kind of overall sense of what Christianity is actually about. So, encouraging the kid to do one or more complete read-throughs of the Bible, selecting various themes that we encounter in the Old Testament and the New Testament and connecting them to each other, to give the kid just sort of a larger sense of, here's who God is, here's what he has done, here's how it all makes sense. A lot of people who've been raised in church cannot really give you a sensible account of what Christianity teaches. They might be able to give you some sound bites that they have encountered in Sunday school classes or in sermons, but they can't really say, well, here's basically the message of the Bible. And that's kind of unfortunate. Another level of integration that has to do with Scripture would be the integration of Bible or theology with other academic content. And again, I'm assuming a Christian theological framework here. And this simply means that whatever your student is doing in literature, in the sciences, the natural sciences, the human sciences, history, geography, mathematics, yes, theology can be integrated with mathematics. Whatever your student is doing in these various areas, do whatever you can to connect it with things that God has revealed about himself in Scripture. Now, there are artificial, silly ways that we can do that. And I'm not advocating that you do something artificial or silly, but there are all kinds of perfectly natural, very sensible ways in which you can find opportunities while studying literature or while studying history to bring in the sovereignty of God, or his redemptive plan, or the human condition. I mean, there's opportunities all over the place to talk about the human condition as expressed in Scripture. And then finally, the integration of a Christian worldview with everyday life. Now, I'm going to be doing a separate workshop on Christian worldview early this evening. But and the idea of worldview has become kind of trendy in over the past 2 or 3 decades, and I think that overall this is a good thing. It's a positive thing. But what it has often led to is the realization that we probably need to move our microphones down a little bit, and that may alleviate some of the... Can you still hear me? Okay. But in addition to that, it has led to something else. Still sounds just as loud. It has led to a sense that many people have that worldview is something separate. It is its own distinct class that can be taught separate from the rest of the curriculum. And in a pinch that can be done. But the ideal is to teach Christian worldview throughout the curriculum, to use studies in literature as an opportunity to teach Christian worldview, and to use just everyday living, a trip to the shopping mall as an opportunity to illustrate. I did a field trip with a group of my students. Was it last year?
Year before, I think.
The year before last. And I didn't realize that it was going to be as eye-opening for some of them as it turned out to be. We spent a couple of hours at Hamilton Place Mall, and it was sort of a scavenger hunt. And they were looking for various kinds of worldview cues in the signage, the advertising, the way products were being represented, just the whole environment. And it was this revolutionary experience for some of these kids who had been to the mall many times before, but they had never really had their Christian spectacles on while walking around in the mall. And they became aware of so many things, so many messages, so many perspectival things, so many subliminal messages that you get just doing a walkthrough of Hamilton Place Mall. So the integration of a Christian worldview with just everyday living is another level of integration. Okay, still feel like terrible things are happening here. Let me move it down a little bit more. Can you still hear me? Maybe I'm unnecessarily self-conscious about this thing. I feel like I'm creating shrieks similar to those of a carnivorous bird sweeping down from on high, hoping for a tasty meal. Perhaps my image was not well chosen. Having talked about various models of integration, let's look at some strategies. Some strategies for bringing unity into your kids' educational experience. And one of them, perhaps not the ideal one, but there's a great deal to be said for it within a disciplined framework, and that is let your child's interests drive the selection of materials. Now, a lot of home educating families are into certain models of they might call it unschooling or a very relaxed approach to home education, which to me borders on anarchy, and I'm not necessarily advocating that, but I think there is a sense in which if your kid is fascinated with airplanes, grab armfuls of books about airplanes, because what will happen is the child will eventually become interested in things like the physics of flight, the design of a wing, how birds' wings are similar to airplane wings. The kid may become interested in aerodynamics, may become interested in mathematics. And, there's so many different directions. May become interested in the history of World War II, the invention of the airplane in the first place, the airline industry. There's just many different directions in which that can go. I think it would be a terrible idea to build an entire educational program around the whims of a 12-year-old. However, there is a sense in which if the 12-year-old is obviously drawn intellectually to certain things, that can be fed, and that will introduce a kind of default unity. It's like, I'm studying, oh, Mom, let me read some more books about airplanes. And that creates a kind of center of gravity. Okay, another approach would be what is often called unit studies. I'm walking toward you because I'm afraid of the speaker. I keep feeding back. If I face this way, I think I'm less likely to feed back. But then these people are all going to get up and leave, being mortally offended. Unit studies, Konos. Are they still around? Do people still do Konos? K-O-N-O-S?
I think so.
I mean, they were all the rage like 10 years ago. There are these unit studies programs in which, for a period of 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month or a couple of months, you sort of focus in one area, and like everything the kid is doing is in that one area, like Native American cultures. And during the period in which you're investigating Native American cultures, you look at the design of various kinds of dwellings, hogans and teepees, and while studying a teepee, you learn a little bit about the geometry of cones and conic sections, and so it can go in a mathematical direction. Unit studies provides a certain kind of module. I'm tempted just to turn this thing off.
If you need to, that's fine.
I mean,
if you need to, it's fine.
Okay, it's getting worse. Everything I try to do to fix it is just making it worse. Am I talking louder and louder as we go along? So unit studies can introduce a kind of modular unity. I think ultimately unit studies brings in just a larger...
Maybe it's your hands getting close.
It doesn't like that hand. Unit studies can bring in just a larger level of fragmentation. Maybe it depends on how you do it. Then there's the idea of a classical curriculum. Now, the term classical is problematic because it can be used to mean a lot of different things, depending on, there's classical conversations. People have called my program classical. There's, maybe you've read the famous essay by Dorothy Sayers in which she sort of jump-started the modern interest in classical education in the 40s, I think it was, that she wrote that. But what's unifying about classical education is that it tends to be built. I don't think it's worth it. What do I do? If I just set it over here.
Just project.
Okay, I'm speaking to you just as one guy to a group of normal people, no intervening technology. I feel better already. Classical, as it's often understood, classical education is built around a set of themes. It can involve, although it doesn't have to, the teaching of Latin, or perhaps Greek, perhaps other classical languages, perhaps Hebrew, but Latin tends to be a big thing among people who are into classical education. A lot of emphasis on critical thought, the teaching of logic, very often Aristotelian logic. You're actually drawing heavily on Aristotle, who is basically the guy who first systematized the study of logic. The idea had been around before Aristotle that it's good to make sense. Making sense is better than not making any sense. But it was Aristotle who first came along and drafted a bunch of rules for how logic should operate. And a lot of people who are into classical education, they draw heavily on the works that Aristotle wrote on logic. A heavy emphasis on history, more emphasis than many curricula give to history. So these kinds of things, and in general, maybe just more of a substantiality, more of a sense that we're studying real stuff here, keeping the fluff to a minimum. So a classical curriculum can provide a kind of conventionalized unity. Now here's two approaches that I find compelling. One of them is using history as the integration point, letting history be the hub around which everything else is gathered. Now you'll find that doesn't work for everything, but it works for a lot of stuff. It works for literature, it can work for politics, it can work for the development of various disciplines. For instance, if you're wanting your child to study sort of an introduction to psychology, one way to approach that is through the history of the development of psychological ideas. Rather than just studying psychological thought as if it just sprang fully formed out of the bog, instead you go back to the people who first started establishing basic psychological principles and then carry the history of psychology all the way up to recent events. And then the kid gets a sense of where these ideas came from in the first place, whether they were well received in their own time, why or why not. And I think studying a discipline like that historically actually equips the kid to criticize it, and by criticize I simply mean to look at it in an analytical and informed way, better than if he is taught that the discipline just sort of sprang, fully formed just out of nowhere. A lot of people in school are not given a sense that every academic discipline came from somewhere and has a history. Things are often taught as if they just sort of exist absolutely in space and time. But if students are given a sense of where ideas came from, then the student thinks, well, somebody came up with that idea for the first time. That person may or may not have been correct. I wonder what that person's reasons were for coming up with that idea. I wonder what his opponents argued against the idea. I wonder how those who were considered leaders in his field received that idea when it first emerged. It just gives the student a more three-dimensional sense of how to evaluate ideas. So using history as the integration point can be one way to gather at least large portions of the curriculum together. Another way of integrating the curriculum can be using philosophy as the integration point. Now some of you are thinking, philosophy? I never even studied philosophy. I don't really understand philosophy. I'm under the impression that philosophy is a lot of confusing terms and abstruse arguments that have nothing to do with the real world. And in some university philosophy departments, that may be the sort of thing that is put across as philosophy. I'm using the term philosophy here very, very broadly. I just mean ideas and how they work. So philosophy could actually include theology. It could include just any explanatory structure by which we are trying to come to terms with the world. Political thought or social theory, or that would all count as philosophy. So taking an ideas-oriented approach and building a lot of the education around that. Some kids are going to be more story-oriented, more narrative-oriented, and for them, a more history-oriented approach may be good. Other kids may be more idea analysis-oriented, and an issue or idea-based approach may work well for them. There's a book written by a guy named Michael Macrone. I think it was unavailable for a few years, and it's available again. It's called Eureka! 81 Key Ideas Explained. The guy is definitely not a Christian, and that actually does poison a few of the entries in the book a little bit. I may have just offended somebody. It renders him not very objective in presenting certain things. Overall, it's a magnificent book. It would be a little bit rough, for a 6th grader. For a sharp high schooler, it would be like meat and gravy. I've got students who have loved that book and other students who have absolutely hated it. And generally, whether they love or hate that book falls along whether they're more narrative-oriented or idea-oriented. But that's just an example of the kind of thing that's out there. Eureka, 81 Ideas Explained, it takes 81 of the sort of defining discussions or paradigms that have appeared over the past 3,000 years, and he talks about them, and each one gets 2 or 3 pages of discussion. So it's not this long, agonizing, detailed discussion. It's just sort of an introduction to the idea. Freudian psychoanalysis. It's good to know something about that. The idea that Descartes came up with, I think, therefore I am. Everybody likes to quote that, but actually having access to a discussion of it, what Descartes was actually up to, can be very helpful. Einstein's theory of relativity. There's actually two different chapters. Each chapter is 2 or 3 pages long. 2 different chapters devoted to that. Quantum theory. There's some stuff devoted to that. So there's models in psychology, physics, some things that the ancient Greek philosophers had to say, things that modern philosophers have to say. The idea that we can't ultimately know about reality because everything is shaped by our minds, which is an idea that Immanuel Kant was playing around with a little over 200 years ago, and everybody is playing around with it today. So that's an important idea to understand. It's all in there. So just recognize that the guy he doesn't always present Christianity as sympathetically as you would want, as probably most of you here would want. But it's a great book, and it's a great introduction to 81 important ideas that are important to the idea architecture of our civilization. And there's lots of stuff like that out there. Another approach would be a combination of both number 4 and number 5, using history and philosophy as integration points, which actually brings us down to how my program operates, because that's sort of what I do. At Foundations Collegium, the programs that I offer generally are gathered either around a historical sequence or a body of ideas. You've got worldview, critical thought, Christian theology, biblical studies, cosmography. All of that stuff is kind of thought-oriented. Different kinds of models, different patterns of understanding. So that's all one package over here. And then all the entire history of human civilization from earliest beginnings to the present, including the literature, the arts, the great ideas, the history of religion, the history of the Christian faith, which I actually put in a different category from the history of religion. When I say the history of religion, I mean all the other religions. This is me being a Christian. And the history of the Christian church I provide with its own category. But all of that is gathered in the overall context of the flow of history. So when we're studying the ancient world, we're doing the literature of the ancient world, the religions that had their origins in the ancient world, political life of the ancient world. Then we move on to the Middle Ages, then the modern world. And so all these things are moving in parallel. The literature that we're studying, the philosophy that we're studying, it all moves forward chapter by chapter, historical period by historical period. Okay, now we've gotten close to the end of our presentation. Let me present two possible objections to this way of thinking. First objection: my umbrella school requires credit in specific, isolated academic subjects. Show of hands. Yes, everybody. That's what most of y'all are probably confronted with, unless you have one of these rare umbrella schools that are really interested in enterprising models for education and sort of bending over backwards to accommodate your creative approach to teaching your kids. But a lot of umbrella schools are sort of impatient with that sort of thing, and they want to know how many credits in English, how many credits in this, how many credits in that. So my answer would be, that's okay. Do whatever you think will best serve your child's education, and in as unified a fashion as you can manage. When you've arrived at a structure that meets the needs of your child, figure out a way to fit it into the structure your umbrella school requires. You can be creative without being dishonest. It may turn out to be easier than you'd anticipated. Aaron Academy is an umbrella school that has an exhibit here. We have worked with them in the past, and they're very sympathetic to what we're trying to do. And what we're doing curricularly, from a curricular point of view, it's weird, it's unconventional, and it doesn't necessarily map out over the way people are used to seeing academic subjects, and Aaron Academy has been willing to work with us on that. Isn't there another Home Life Academy or somebody that you've had experience with?
We have not worked out a relationship like that with them.
Okay. But I know that Aaron Academy is very forgiving when it comes to unconventionality. You guys are homeschoolers. What's the problem with unconventionality? It should be a given. So they are sympathetic to this kind of approach. Okay, a second objection. The materials I've been able to find for my child are all separated out by subject area or class in the way that you, Mr. Bird, have criticized. How can I use them? And most academic materials are structured, in accordance with the assumptions of separate subject areas. The materials you have located may be wonderful, and the only problem with them is that they are set up to serve the needs of individual classes. And if that's the case, you're in good shape. You can do the integrating yourself. Refer to some of the models that I presented earlier. Model number 4, I don't even know what that is. History is the integration point. Okay. You learn something about your own presentation every day. Model number 4 may be the easiest of these if you're just starting out and are having to use materials that assume a separation between subjects. It's not that hard to integrate history and literature. There's a gentleman here who is going to be giving a seminar on integrating history and literature. I noticed that as we were setting up yesterday. History provides a very natural, sensible, and convenient matrix for the integration of various kinds of content. Also, it really is pretty easy to find material that is not set up on the assumption of different subject areas. Sometimes these will not be resources intended to be used as textbooks or curriculum. Sometimes you have to step out of the textbook box. Children's historical fiction. There's a lot of great stuff out there. Newbery Award winners, some of which are excellent. G.A. Henty, the other similar authors who take historical scenarios and they insert characters into them and they weave these stories, and those can be good ways to acclimate kids to different eras in history. Topical books on subjects like ancient Rome, the Renaissance and or Reformation, Jane Austen's World. There's a book called Jane Austen's World. It's magnificent. It went out of publication a few years ago, then it reappeared. I hope it's still in publication. It's really good. And there are other books similar to this out there. Basically, what Jane Austen's World, and it's one of these oversized hardbacks. It's about that coffee table type book. Not only does it give you a guided tour of Jane Austen's 6 published novels and the one that was never published, that was never finished, Sanditon, but it gives you a guided tour of the society in which she lived, England in the late 1700s and early 1800s. What was it like to be in the military? It talks about the Navy, the Army in Jane Austen's time, because officers very often are featured as characters in these novels. Social practices, meal times, what sorts of parlor games did people engage in during this period? So it just sort of gives you a broadly textured view of not only Jane Austen's literary world, but the whole social and historical environment that she was functioning in. So after reading that, the kid, even if it's a boy, may be interested in reading one or more of Jane Austen's novels, and at any rate will have gotten an excellent view of what at least the English-speaking world was like in the period from like 1750 to about 1850. Great book. By its very nature, it's integrative. It brings all kinds of things together. And there's all kinds of books like that. Interdisciplinary books or video series, and very often these are produced by non-Christian filmmakers, documentary producers, and you can just step in and give colored commentary. Kenneth Clark's Civilization is an excellent sort of history of Western culture from late antiquity to, I think he stopped somewhere in the 1800s. I'm trying to remember. James Burke's Connections. Have any of y'all seen the Connections series? James Burke is this Englishman who wears leisure suits and is very witty, and he's always making these clever remarks. But what he does is he will start with some incident in the ancient or medieval world, and then he will trace a line of cause and effect that takes you up to some technological reality of the contemporary world, like the atomic bomb, or computers, or credit cards. And he'll start out with some coin that was being minted in ancient Sumeria, or something. So the line of causation may be a little bit contrived at times, but it's just a wonderful rollicking romp through history and the way various things can lead to other things. And a kid who was not previously interested in history might become interested in history. And that it might be more of a guy-oriented, here I am stereotyping, but it might be more of a guy-oriented kind of experience because it has a lot to do with science and technology and inventions. I think it's fascinating for anybody. Carl Sagan's Cosmos. Carl Sagan can be fun to make fun of, the way he says billions and billions, etc. Cosmos really is a magnificent book and documentary series. And what you're going to do, if you're a Christian, is you're going to have your thumb poised over the pause button. And you're going to be constantly pausing it and then giving commentary on the various assumptions that are built into the observations that Carl Sagan makes about the universe. Because Carl Sagan was by no means a Christian. He was very much a secular humanist with sort of maybe a mildly, romantic, pantheistic sort of a thing. I mean, he seems to love nature so much, he has almost a kind of an adoring attitude toward the structure of the physical world. It's interesting to watch. It's like he wants there to be a God, and since he doesn't believe in God, he seems very fascinated with nature. So Carl Sagan's Cosmos series, which is very well done, and it has lots of assumptions built into it that would be inimical to a Christian perspective, but you've got your thumb on the pause button. You can stop it at any point and say, let's talk about that thing that he just said. That is a great way for students to learn, and it's a great way for them to learn to engage ideas that may not be 100% accurate. Okay, websites. Lots of websites out there that can be instrumental in helping us integrate various kinds of materials together, integrating literature with history, integrating this with that. So the internet is just a wonderland of all kinds of stuff. Some of it not very good, some of it magnificent. Anglo-Saxon literature in the original language, oh yeah. You can find lots of websites in which Beowulf is written in Anglo-Saxon, or other Old English poets from like 1,000 or 1,500 years ago, written in the original Anglo-Saxon, which is not recognizable as English unless you are a language scholar. It is so, some people refer to Shakespeare's English as Old English. That's not Old English, that's modern English. It's early modern English, but before that was Middle English, which is Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, which is very strange but still recognizable as English. And before that is technically what we should call Old English or Anglo-Saxon. And it is so different from what we have come to know as English, it is not recognizable. And you can find websites in which there are works of literature that were written 1,200 years ago in the original Anglo-Saxon, and your kids might develop a fascination with language and the development of language. So there's just all kinds of stuff. Examples of Byzantine art. You can find lots of Byzantine art. Biographical info on Sir Isaac Newton, or St. Anthony of the Desert, or John Stuart Mill. Discussion of the works of J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis. Scads of stuff. Material on the debate between Arminians and Calvinists on the nature of salvation. Lots of stuff. And it's free. That's the great thing about the internet. There's all this free stuff out there. So, Foundations Collegium is a program, one of the cornerstones of which is unity. The idea that it's important to give a child an integrated understanding of how everything fits together, how everything works, and we try to do that in a variety of ways. If anyone would like to come by our booth, we're just right over there. I'd love to talk with you at greater length about what exactly Foundations Collegium is. It's a program for basically teens, fairly sharp Christian teens who aren't afraid of doing a little work, doing some reading, doing some thinking, and being challenged and having the time of their lives.